everybody. Welcome to another edition of 5 Minutes in 1 Peter. You've probably noticed that I'm doing this outside today. I'm really thankful that it's about 80 degrees. It's a little warm, but it's so much better than it has been. So I'm thankful to be enjoying God's Word today as I film this video. We're in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 1 through 6 today. We are rounding the bases. There are only 5 chapters in this letter that we've been in since practically the beginning of COVID. And so we're in chapter 4 today. Chapter 4, starting at verse 1. Why don't you join me there? Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality and passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery. And they malign you, but they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the Spirit the way God does. And that's the whole thrust of this text, is rather than living like the world around us, we live in the Spirit the way God lives in the Spirit, in beauty and in wholeness and in healing and in joy and in righteousness. That's the thrust of this. But let's get there. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. 35,000 foot view of this whole book, this whole letter. Remember, Peter is writing to scattered Christians, people who aren't living in Israel or Jerusalem, people, scattered Christians across southern Asia, that modern day Turkey, ancient Galatia. They're scattered in these little communities, and they are a distinct minority. And they are being persecuted for their faith. Chapter 4 begins to give us a little bit more color on exactly what their persecution looked like and why. If you go down to verse 3, he talks about the practices of the pagan world. And it says that these pagans are maligning these people of God. Why are they maligning them? Because they're not participating in the things that they do. What is it that they do? Again, verse 3, sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. The people of God have withdrawn from those. They've abstained from those type of behaviors. They've withdrawn not from pagan people, we can assume. They're living in the same cities and towns, but they don't participate in the same practices of the pagans, and they're being maligned and ridiculed for that. And Peter is writing to encourage them. And this is why he starts off by saying this in verse 1. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. Arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, meaning this: if Christ suffered for righteousness, so will people who are in Christ. So will people who are in Christ. And he says that we need to arm ourselves with that truth, that reality. We need to arm ourselves with that. We need to fortify ourselves and strengthen ourselves in the truth that if we belong to Jesus, we are probably going to receive some level, some degree of suffering in our lives related to our righteous practices. He says, arm yourself with this. And here's the thing. If we don't arm ourselves with this mentality, we're probably going to compromise and give in to the cultural practices around us. And that is not God's way. Why? Because when you get down to the bottom of this, as we said a moment ago, God's design for us is to live the way that God lives in the Spirit. He doesn't want us to live the way that the pagans live. And so he says this, arm yourself with this way of thinking. And then he says, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Whoa! People who follow Jesus and think this way, they no longer sin ever again. I don't think that's what Peter has in mind. The full counsel of the New Testament tells us that even those who are in grace will fall, they will stumble, they will sin at times. What he has in mind are the explicit cultural practices of the pagans. Again, orgies, drinking parties, lawless idolatries, drunkenness, things like that. We are to abstain from those cultural practices. This is what he means when he says we don't sin, but rather, verse 2, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh. We all live in the flesh. We've all got skin. No longer for human passions, but for the will of God. No longer driven by human passions, but surrendered to the will of God. For the time has passed. It's past for the Gentiles to behave this way. That time is under God's judgment. That time is going to be done away with. We, anticipating the second coming of Jesus and the new creation and our resurrection, we anticipate that time when we won't live according to human passions, but in the will of God. And we begin to live in that rhythm, in that spirit now. And so we come to the end of this. He says, they will give account. The people who live and follow according to debaucherous practices, they will give an account for this to God, who is the judge. And he judges the living and the dead. And then it ends with this interesting verse. For this is why the gospel, verse 6, was preached even to those who are dead. What is he talking about here? Preached to the dead. Remember, he's talking about people who are either living in idolatry or living for the will of God. And so the preaching to those who are dead here is probably talking about people who are living in resistance or rejection to the ways of God, following their debaucherous practices. The gospel was preached to them, and they are still going to give an account. But for us who are in Christ Jesus, it is not God's will that we live according to the debaucherous practices of this present evil age, but rather according to the righteousness of God. And I love the way he says it here, that we might live in the Spirit the way God does. It's not just about doing the right thing and not doing the wrong thing. It's about living the God kind of life, a life of wholeness and joy, a life of health and peace, a life that's surrendered to him. That's the best life that we could possibly live. And I encourage you to join me in that, guys. Hey, I'll see you next week when we start verse 7. Have a great day.